We have with us today Mike Vogt and Mary Jones. They're both affiliated with Camp Dodge and the Gold Star Museum as well up there. And they're going to present about Camp Dodge. And as I see, she's got Urbandale's neighbor to the north, which I think is kind of cool because there are some houses still in Urbandale that are old Camp Dodge houses. And you'll mention that a little bit about the houses, I know, in your presentation. We've been talking with them since last, originally we planned on having this in November, but then when the house became registered on the National Historic Places, it kind of bumped them out of November, so we now have them here today on a beautiful day. I promised Mary that the weather would be great. I came through.
We're going to make him the weatherman.
So, Mary and Mike, it's yours.
Okay. First off, how many people have been on Camp Dodge or worked on Camp Dodge? So hopefully a lot of this will be familiar, and you might even know more than we do about Camp Dodge because everybody's got a great Camp Dodge story. So as we said, it's Urbandale's neighbor to the north, and Camp Dodge has been in existence for more than 110 years. It's always had ties to the military and the community, and we kind of like to visit a little bit about some of Camp Dodge's history. We'd have you here so you were driving home in the dark if we talked about all of the history. But I'd watch me see if I can use this. Got a little carried away yesterday gardening. Got the restaurant. We kind of have to go before Camp Dodge started to talk about, well, how the heck did it get here in this area? And as the Iowa Guard became the Guard in about 1877, there were many communities. Everybody fought to have a Guard unit because it was a sign of prestige and they wanted bragging rights. But they also had to come together to train because usually it was just a company at each armory throughout the state. So sooner or later they had to get together and do some training. There was a 2-week training period, and they usually met near a host community. And of course everybody wanted to host the Guard too because like now it's like a convention. You get people to come out to watch, you get everybody coming into town, you've got the money and all the viewership of coming out because before TV, that was pretty exciting. However, about 1890, there came a call for a permanent camp somewhere in the state because it was expensive to transport to each community that was hosting. It was expensive to set up an area where the troops could practice. And it got to be, this is Camp Bentley near the Waterloo Fairgrounds, so you can kind of see they needed a fairly good area to set up in. And then in about 1890, as I said, there was this call, and you can see this group of angelic young men, who of course would never, create any ruckus wherever they went. However, yeah, boys will be boys, and they always called them the boys. We never heard about young men, it was always our boys. Let's see, in 1896, soldiers removed some wood from a fence on their campground in Ottumwa. The landowner's prize racing mare became entangled in the remaining wire and died. That resulted in a claim against the Guard for $1,000, which is about $20,000 in today's money. A 1900 camp in Red Oak received an Inspector General's report that it was a most unusual and disgraceful amount of liquor and destruction of private property. Then in 1901 they had it near Dubuque, and Dubuque, their paper says, "It is not likely that any city or town will be very anxious to become the permanent camping place for the State Guard unless the officers in charge can exercise a better supervision over the men than they have done in Dubuque." It is generally supposed that the militia meets for actual practice and training, but a very large number of those in attendance here the past week spent most of their time carousing around among saloons and the balance of the time raising disturbances.
Keep in mind also the local units, like if there was a company from the host community, it was oftentimes like, you know, Old Home Week, because the family would come to visit them and they'd have a picnic and they'd bring them chicken and things like that. So it was not the rigid camp that you might imagine for anybody here that's a veteran.
One of the early adjutant generals, Melvin Byers, they couldn't even get the poor man's name right in the paper, it's Melville there. He thought, even though he was from southwest Iowa, he thought central Iowa would be a good place to have a training camp. It was accessible by rail from all over the state, which is how they primarily traveled when they came to camp. They talked a little bit about settling down in Fort Des Moines because there was already a regular Army camp there. The state agreed to purchase 160 acres next to the fort in 1904, and some temporary buildings were put up. But when you get a bargain, the land was too wet, the area was too small, and they forgot to think that the Army mission and the National Guard mission were totally different, so they weren't getting the benefits of sharing ground and sharing training. Oh, there you go. It is. Sorry. No, that's okay. We locked it so it wouldn't bounce. Come on in.
The post located at Fort Des Moines was a U.S. Army cavalry post, and the troops occupied that site about 1901. And the majority of Iowa Guard units were infantry. And the three combat arms at that time were infantry, cavalry, and artillery. So the type of drilling and routine training that the cavalry did was not the same that the infantry did. So it was very, very touched on, and it didn't really lead to a lot of cohesive back and forth training of the two disparate missions of the cavalry and the infantry.
And then, as in now, the Adjutant General is the appointee of the governor, and politics, fancy that, started to come into where they were located. Cedar Rapids was really ticked off that they wanted to put it up here. They already had a rifle range, and they wanted the business of having the guard come in, permanently for 2 weeks a year. So, this finally, they accused the Adjutant General of taking payoffs and buy-offs, and so he was eventually forced out of the position, and they, of course, brought in another Adjutant General who also advocated for up here, and he, in turn, was driven out. Meanwhile, the federal government had purchased land for a shooting range northwest of Des Moines. And here's the Des Moines River, just north of us, and of course where Saylorville is now. And then the rifle range was right in this area right here. We haven't really figured out why they picked that area, but that's, again, even though they had stuff down at Fort Des Moines, they chose a rifle range up here north of Des Moines. So some of the Camp Dodge people, or not Camp Dodge, but Iowa National Guard people started looking to the north here, thinking, well, if we've got the shooting range right across from us, perhaps some land up in this area would be a good place for a permanent campground. And so they located some land along the inner urban railway, which of course they needed to get the troops in. And on April 12, 1909, the first 78 acres is purchased. And this is that land overlaid on a World War I map, but you can and a photo. Here's the pool. So this little area right here was the original Camp Dodge. And if you go to the museum, you're also standing on original Camp Dodge land. The general that got it done was Guy Logan from Red Oak, Iowa. And in 1910, he directed that the post be named in honor of Major General Grenville Dodge, who
And General Dodge was not an Iowa native, but he lived in Council Bluffs when the Civil War started. He raises troops, some companies of local Council Bluffs area were in rural folks that formed the 4th Infantry Regiment. He led them at the Battle of Pea Ridge, Arkansas. He serves and ends up leading the Army as a Major General, 2-star general. And before he left, he had commanded the Union spy network for General Grant. He was trained as a civil engineer with a specialty in railroads and railroad bridges and trestles. And so he put that skill set to work also during the Civil War, rebuilding railroads and trestles that had been destroyed as a result of the war, or that the Confederates put the torch to as Union troops moved into the South. Very well known. I want to say he did a term in Congress. I don't remember that. But
I think he did, and he was very disillusioned with it.
yeah, it wasn't quite what he wanted. And then the Union Pacific picked him up as the chief surveyor and engineer, not engineer blow the whistle or the hat, but to survey the route out to Promontory Point, Utah. So when you see the trains today that say Union Pacific, it is the Union Pacific that built west from Council Bluffs / Omaha out to Utah, and the Central Pacific built eastward, and they met at Promontory Point, Utah, May of 1869. So Dodge is a pretty well-known guy. A lot of individuals, other countries consulted him. He helped build the Trans-Siberian Railway, was a consultant for that project, also some railroad building in Cuba. So a pretty well-known guy. He served on a commission to look into allegations of atrocities committed by American troops, allegedly committed by American troops in the Philippines during the Philippine War, which followed the Spanish-American War. And so he was very well known. He moved back to Iowa. His home is if you're ever looking for a bus trip, his home is a museum over in Council Bluffs if you get a chance to see that. So a name everybody would have known and recognized.
By 1911, Camp Dodge hosted the first regimental annual encampment. This wasn't a full statewide thing, but usually there were about a fourth of the state was a regiment. Then in 1914, we had our first all-Iowa Guard encampment. A member of Company L, 55 Regiment, suffered a casualty through drowning, which the Des Moines River, throughout time, as we had soldiers, proved to be a dangerous place. And surprise, surprise, they arrested some bootleggers here. And as you can see, they're much more sedate young boys than that. The first military building that was constructed was built in 1915. The Iowa National Guard had been looking for a place for their arsenal to store their weapons, their bullets, whatever they happened to have on hand. And they had been looking at downtown Des Moines, but there was no place where they could put it that would again be by that magic railroad. This North Arsenal was designed by Frank E. Wetherell, which is, he was a fairly, throughout the years, well-known architect. He designed some armories for us and other buildings. It was guaranteed fireproof, and by 1916, the post had grown to 570 acres. Then, 1916, it got a really big workout because of the Mexican border hostilities.
Mexico was wrought with revolutions in the early 20th century, and if I remember correctly, there was a president, Mexican President Huerta, who had been a friend with Pancho Villa, and when Huerta became president, him and Pancho Villa sort of parting their ways. President Wilson recognizes Huerta as the legitimate Mexican president, and that got Pancho Villa upset, and him and his bandits rode across the U.S. border and attacked a town in New Mexico, Brownsville, New Mexico, killed maybe a dozen Americans. They were followed by a U.S. cavalry unit and chased as far as they could get them, exchanged a few shots. But after that happened, there were other crossings of the border. So President Wilson orders General Pershing, he was a brigadier general at that time, John Joseph Pershing, to take American troops into Mexico with their permission to hunt down Villa. They get close, but they never catch him. The Mexicans grow tired of an American army moving around in their backyard. Diplomatic relations with the Mexicans become frayed, and there was worry that we were going to go to war with Mexico. And this is 1916, 1917, the First World War is underway, and more on that in a minute. But they end up mobilizing National Guard units to guard the U.S. border to prevent any incursions either by people that were sympathetic to Pancho Villa or by Mexican Army units, should things go bad with our relations there. As a result, Iowa Guard troops go down to the Mexican border in June of 1916, and they begin to return home in January, through January, March of 1917. But Camp Dodge is used as an assembly point for the Iowa Guard units prior to their arrival on the Mexican border. And the photo that Mary is featured there shows one of the artillery units, a gun from Battery D, gun part for Battery D.
Also, when they were about to be deployed, the family, of course, all had to come out. And one news article said that there was a traffic jam to Camp Dodge, 5 miles long, which I have a hard time believing. That's a lot of miles into the Des Moines area, but then again, it's very possible. But they all wanted to come and see the boys off. Okay, then I kind of did a little search to see what was happening in the Urbandale area. And I had found an article that says James Woodward at the Princess Cigar Store was prepared to take parties to Camp Dodge by auto. And I thought that was kind of enterprising, and maybe he didn't get caught in the traffic jam. But up above was something that made me even just a little sad. And we know that war affects not only the soldiers, but as some of us were talking earlier, the families as well. And this article says, Mrs. Mary Alexander, colored, 3635 Cornell Avenue, for days has been reading with intense interest of the Negro cavalry troops in Mexico, which I was not familiar with. She was deeply affected by the story of their heroism and death. Word was received Saturday from her son Leonard in South Dakota that he had enlisted in the South Dakota National Guard and awaited the call to the front. Visions of her own boy being ambushed and treacherously killed in a foreign land proved a burden too heavy to bear. A woman's coat and hat found at 3 o'clock Sunday morning in Birdland on the bank of the Des Moines River, a block east of the Urbandale Bridge, told the story of a mother's love and death. A pencil and a blank piece of paper lay under her hat. She was a mother of 9. Her youngest would have been 7 at the time of her death. Her son Leonard did, of course, come back safe, and by 1930 he was living in Chicago. In kind of an odd parallel, one of her other sons happened to accidentally drown near Marshalltown in 1936. I always have to follow everything towards that. But just one of those little things that, because I was looking through the word Urbandale, we've popped up a story of a mother's fear and loss. And
What newspaper was that?
The Ames Evening Times, 27 June 1916, which would have been about when
They were deployed.
the guys were deployed. So. And she's buried in Glendale Cemetery. Okay. Those of you who are familiar with Camp Dodge, there are still traces of pre-World War I there. That arsenal still stands. and is still used every day by the Guard. Remember earlier I said Mr. Weatherall had said it was guaranteed fireproof, and it was put to the test. There was a man named Charles Kinsey. He was sweeping up the basement. He had a bucket of sweepings. He thought they were floor sweepings, but actually it was gunpowder. Blew him across the room. The Adjutant General, who was quartered downtown in Des Moines, came out in his personal car and picked Mr. Kinsey up and took him to the hospital. And as a Camp Dodge employee, we're smart. We put out the fire by flooding the basement. One of the houses that was part of the original land purchase is still there and is still used by the Guard and can be seen in a lot of the panoramic pictures that you might have seen. This is a picture in 1998 when the roof blew off during that lovely storm that we all endured back then. Another trace is another house that was purchased, and this was the John and Florida White homestead. It's painted white now, so everyone thinks it's called the White House because it's white, but actually the owners did. They had a number of children. They had, I think, a teacher that was teaching nearby living in the house. In some places, the walls are about 8 inches thick. Once you're inside, you're kind of in a little cocoon. It's very quiet in there. It was used through the years in the 20s as a blacksmith shop. It was used as headquarters for annual training. It was an initial headquarters in World War I. And then as time went on and it was fixed up again, it was used as a traditional residence of the Adjutant General.
Is that still there?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
One more quick thing about Urbandale, and then we'll turn World War I over to Mike. Again, as I was searching, there's a gentleman by the name of F.F. Frost that offers an Urbandale house and acreage. This was in 1918. And one of his features was Camp Dodge paved road. So again, Camp Dodge is a good selling point for these new houses coming up. Here's another ad of Clover Acres. Anybody familiar with that? That's on Merle Hay Road, paved road to Camp Dodge. What was interesting to me, as you were talking about some of the Camp Dodge buildings being taken off, Mr. Frost must have been a very enterprising developer. After World War I, he moved a number of what they called the Camp Dodge huts off to the fairground area and made like a little development, and you could go out and put your name on the house that you wanted, and you got a well and a privy, and it was like fairly small houses, but there's a lot of them still there that have been built on. So Mr. Frost was quite the businessman in his day here in Urbandale and out on the east side of Des Moines.
Just curious, does anyone here have an ancestor that was at Camp Dodge in World War I? That's rare. Usually a hand goes up. You did? Okay, we got one. Usually one or two hands that go up. The United States goes to war with Germany on April 6, 1917, following a congressional vote that day to do so. And the Europeans had been at war since 1914. The combating nations had divided into two groups, the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey against the French, British, Belgians, Russians, and the Italians under the war in 1915 on the Allied side. The United States is drawn into that war because of the neutral rights and the sinking of passenger ships, etc. And the United States, like I said, goes to war in April of 1917. First thing they need to do is increase the size of the U.S. Army. Guard troops, regular Army troops, and Army Reserve troops at that time totaled about 200,000 soldiers. That's the number of casualties in the Battle of the Somme on all sides. So the government realized an army of 200,000 was not going to last very long on a modern battlefield with high explosive shells and rapid fire artillery, machine guns, and poison gas. The Army is organized into 3 large groups and recruited, and all 3 of those groups recruit inductees. The regular Army is organized into 20 divisions. Some of the divisions already existed on paper, but they are slated to have 20 divisions, numbered 1 through 20. The War Department organized guard units, state guard units regionally into divisional size, and a division at that time was 27,000 soldiers, organizes guard units into divisional sized elements. So the Iowa National Guard and the Minnesota, North and South Dakota, and the Nebraska National Guard units become the 34th Division. National Guard divisions are numbered 25 through 50. And then the selective service system goes into effect. Today we still hear selective service. They still use the same term, but that was created in 1916, 1917, the Selective Service Act, and they're the draftees. So divisions numbered 70 and above are draftee units. Uncle Sam needs training grounds for the draftee units in addition to the other troops, and they end up selecting Camp Dodge in June of 1917 to be the training site for the 88th Infantry Division, which was a draftee division. And it would become one of 16 what were called cantonment camps. And they begin construction in June of 1917. And by September 1917, they have 150 barracks buildings constructed. You can see some in the background there. You can see a couple men at work cutting some beams. That image is from a postcard in the collection where I work at the Iowa Gold Star Military Museum out of Camp Dodge. And when we first got that, I remember looking at the back side, and I couldn't quite make out the handwriting. Maybe the pencil wasn't sharp, maybe it had rubbed and abraded over the years, but I couldn't make anything out. And later I ended up getting an eye loop and looking closely at the postcard, what was there, and I realized the reason I couldn't read it is because it was written in Italian. So we know that, we knew this, but we know that there were at least one Italian immigrant out there working, and he wrote on the back side of there and sent it home. So I think carpenters, depending on what they did, were paid 50, 60 cents a day for their wages. And the White's Company was the general contractor. We still see their trailers today. Their company goes back to the 1850s. They're the immigrant from Germany by the name of White's. I can't remember his first name, started building houses as a carpenter, and the company grew from there. The Camp Dodge project really put the White's Company on the map. By the time it was done, there were, depending on what source you read, 1,409 or 1,509 buildings. We don't know if somebody fat-fingered the typewriter, because I think the building numbers go up to 1,509,
Yeah.
and one of the reports says there were 1,409, so, you know, somewhere in between. But it grows to be the largest military base in Iowa's history. The first inductees at Camp Dodge arrived on the 5th or 7th of September 1917, and the first Minnesotan to enter the Army at Camp Dodge as a draftee showed up 2 days early in his own uniform he had bought. His father didn't want him joining the Army, but he came down anyway. His name was J.C. Hormel, or as they would say up in Austin, Hormel, and he was the son to the guy that started the Hormel meatpacking outfit. And his claim to fame is that it's oftentimes used as a punchline, but he was the inventor of Spam. So the inventor of Spam was the first Minnesotan to say. By the end of the war, 111,000 Iowans, or 111,000 troops would enter the Army at Camp Dodge, and that ranked Iowa 12th nationally as far as the number of troops contributed to the U.S. Army during the war. Like I said, Camp Dodge grows to be 5,200 acres. There was an artillery range on the northwest edge of camp. They fired wooden shells. They didn't fire any exploding ordnance. Anybody that builds out there knocks on used to knock on Mary's door, ours, and say, here, they need live shells out here. No, there isn't. But at its peak, there were 20 miles of roads, 24 miles of sewer pipe and water pipe. It was essentially a city constructed in they would continue building until Armistice Day, but it was a city of its own. It had its own fire departments, it had its own power plants, it had its own hospital complex, 2,100 beds, and it would grow, as we said there. You can see Mary Trace.
That's the pool right there. Those of you familiar with the little town of Harold, that's right there. So you can see how big it really became.
And trace the rail line.
Oh, sure.
The
That's
interurban
Interurban.
went all the way through. And of the 16 sites that the Army selected to be a training camp for the draftees, or what was also called the National Army, Camp Dodge was the only one that had a rail line running through it, so that was a big selling point. They brought the War Department representatives out to Hyperion Country Club, and they put them on the porch out there, and they pointed and described to them the vista they could see and the old path of the Des Moines River. It was all floodplain, it was nice and flat, and they said
Was the
that
Hyperion Club there head of this?
it wasn't, predates them maybe
Yes,
a year or
yes.
two. The oldest maps we can find at Camp Dodge, Hyperion's already there. It started out as the Hyperion Golf and Motor Club. If you had the money to belong to the country club out there, you
I
probably had
started
the money.
caddying there when I was 8 years old.
Oh, really?
Now I'm 16,
Yeah,
so we're talking 8, and I'm 87, so 79 years ago.
So the structure that was there as the country club when you worked there would have been the one that they wanted
Yeah,
to dine the War
yeah.
Department folks and
And,
to sell them on Camp Dodge as a building.
And it was like 3 or 4 stories, and it had apartments, and they rented it out because there was an airport out there somewhere too. And you can, yeah, and you can imagine how far Hyperion was from Des Moines.
Yeah.
Now, that was going that was going somewhere.
You know, and in World War I, it was about 8 miles from the fence line of Camp Dodge to the city limits of Des Moines. Young people come out there today and they drive on paved roads, past malls and everything else, but I tell them, it was farmland at that time. Camp Dodge, I want to say it was out in the middle of nowhere, but it was very far removed from any urban area. That was also good as far as boys being boys. You keep them concentrated in one spot, that's good. Also, one of the selling points for Camp Dodge was that there was not a saloon within 10 miles. And that was one of the factors that led the War Department to say, yes, we want to build here.
The auto enthusiasts at Hyperion in the early years were responsible for the building of the speedway to Panora, the highway. And I've seen the contracts on that. They get someone to take care of a mile of the speedway, a farmer with the contract, and one of the things was that you had to remove all stumps from the roadway.
Not to mire us down in terms of phrase, but that's important because in colonial days, they would cut down trees as close as they could or chop them down flush with the surface of the road. But as time goes on, just like the Oregon Trail, you can still see the wagon ruts. As the wagon ruts got deeper and deeper, pretty soon that stump would get closer and closer to the axle. And when you're going along and your axle hits that stump and you come to a stop, that's where the phrase "to be stumped" comes from.
That's great.
What's that settlement on the west side of Beaver Creek there?
That's the remount station, the horse stables were there.
Yeah, over on that one there.
Is it the same thing on that?
Yeah, right there, that's a horse stable?
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
They had concrete stanchions out there, they had an incinerator site out there. We have some items in the collection that I and another guy collected. They take the garbage out there, and what didn't burn, they just pitch down the side of the hill. So if you wander around and it rains or it floods and it goes back down, it kind of washes this stuff to the surface. We found plates and cups that say QMC for quartermaster course or the, and then the concrete stanchions ended up being bulldozed into the tree line and hauled out there. I shouldn't say bulldozed, I don't know what they hauled them, but they ended up shoving them out into the tree line there, and then the trees grew up around them. So as you walk around in that area, there's the broken concrete stanchions are still there as well. And there was a, if you can find it, Mary, there was a dip tank. I don't know if it's still there, near the remount station, and it was probably 8 feet deep, 10 feet deep.
They walk the horses
Yeah,
through.
it angled down and then it was flat and then it angled back up and there were grooves in the concrete. In fact, I haven't been out there in 15 years, but there were a couple of horseshoes that were cemented in there. And what they did is they would treat it with chemicals, and they'd push the horses, and then they would have to swim through the chemically treated water for fleas and things like that, and ticks, and they would get out to the other side, they'd grab them on the other side. But at its peak, estimates vary, about 5,000 head of horses and mules. Trucks, motorcycles, cars were part of the Army's inventory at that time, but the Army primarily still relied on horses and mules as its means of transport.
Can you talk about the pool?
We'll get on to that next,
Oh,
after the
okay.
war, you bet.
Yeah. As they started building these cantonment areas, they'd have entire books on how many nails you needed for each building, how many this, how many that, even down to the toilet seat. So even back then, the Army was big on probably expensive toilet seats.
At its peak in July 1918, there were 46,000 soldiers at Camp Dodge. The 8th Division originally was created as a training division, meaning they would train people up as cooks or bakers or trench mortar crew or infantry or whatever it was, farrier to put, whatever it is, and a teamster. And then once you're up to speed, they would transfer you to another division that was slated to go overseas to France or perhaps was already there. So the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF, was populated with lots of 80 division troops throughout the war. There were 27,000 personnel in a division at that time, and then there were another 18,000 that it took to run the camp. So when Camp Dodge got orders in June of 1918 to recruit to full strength and be deployed to France as an entire division, when they did so, in July of 1918, that's what led to 46,000 troops being there. Never in Iowa's history have there been that many troops in one place at one time. African American troops also arrived at Camp Dodge. The Army is segregated at that time. She mentioned earlier black cavalry units, that would have been the 9th and 10th Cavalry, or Buffalo Soldiers as they were nicknamed, served there. The 366th Infantry Regiment that would serve with the 92nd Division in France and see combat there, they trained at Camp Dodge. They arrived in the fall of 1917 and they departed in June of 1918, but you can see a couple of troops there outside the hospital complex at Camp Dodge. In the upper left are some colored officers, black officers, out at Camp Dodge. The first black officer training camp takes place at Fort Des Moines, and some of those graduates end up coming out to Camp Dodge to gain some leadership experience and to conduct training for soldiers that would eventually go into the 366th Infantry. And then many of them would all deploy from Camp Dodge to the sea service on the Western Front in France.
And so were they segregated throughout in the, the people that were food service and all that kind of thing, all that would have been segregated as far as the trainees themselves?
Yes, a lot of that was done. To get down on that kind of a level, I don't know. But there were white officers, and because the American Army grows to a size it had never been before, they also realized if we're going to induct via the draft and also volunteer enlistees into the Army that are black, we're going to need black officers too. And so they created the Fort Des Moines Black Officer Training, 17th Provisional Training Regiment, and then because of the success of that program, there were some other black officer training camps created at other locations as well. But when you get up past the company grade, past captain, usually the remainder of the officers going up the chain of command were white.
On Camp Dodge, it was actually segregated. The south half down here, kind of just north of the Hyperion, was the black soldiers area. They had their own what they called a hostess house where families could come and visit their soldiers, and they had a Y down there. So all of their facilities were sadly segregated. However, one of the reasons they moved some of them up to Iowa was the even worse problems they were having with racism for the soldiers in the South. And in fact, I can't remember which. One installation, a group of black soldiers froze to death in their tent because they weren't being provided with the things necessary. So many of the black community here welcomed them. They had a black soldiers chorus. And then, of course, most people from this area have also heard the story of the Negro soldiers being hanged at Camp Dodge. We called it basically irreversible military justice, but it was the code of military justice that these things could happen as a group was preparing for war and to move on. Do you want to?
I can elaborate if anybody wants to know more. Late May 1918, a white soldier and his fiancee, she came to camp to visit him, and they had gone to a little area kind of north, I don't want to say, kind of northeast. On the eastern side of Beaver Drive was Dodge City. There were
Yeah,
two
right.
kind of temporary communities with stores, and you could buy candy bars, you know, soda, that sort of thing, and there was a theater there. They had gone up to that area, they were on the way back, and they were approached by a group of 5 or 6 black soldiers who at first said they were MPs, and then they said, well, no, they're not, or we're gonna have to take you to the MP station, and they said, well, okay, that's fine, we'll go with you, and then he was assaulted, she was raped, and later they ended up lining the troops up, and she identified who the assailants were. Initially, 5 were accused, charged with violating the 92nd Article of War. Every soldier, whether you could read or not, and many of the soldiers that showed up at Camp Dodge could not, and I suspect some white soldiers, just like some black soldiers, weren't able to read, but you were sat out, you took a seat, and usually on the ground, and an officer would read you all of the Articles of War, what you are allowed to do and what you are not allowed to do. Rape and murder fall under the 92nd Article of War, so that's the Army regulation that they were tried under as violating. So 5 were accused. They overturned the accusation, although they dismissed the charges against one because somebody else that was involved in it said, oh, I remember being him there, because he had on his brown fatigue uniform, and his friend said, no, that couldn't be, because when he came to the barracks and before he went out that night, he took his brown uniform off and he hung it over the rail because he had to wash it out. He'd been digging in the dirt all day. They said he was not wearing that uniform, and they said, okay, that's good enough for us. They dismissed the charges against him. They were court-martialed at Camp Dodge. 4 were convicted, and the penalties at that time, it could be life in prison or it could be execution. It just sort of depended on what the board decided would be their fate. As the convictions took place at Camp Dodge via the court-martial, as it progressed up the chain of command, they looked at the charges and read through the transcripts, and they ended up dismissing the charges, reversing the charges, the conviction against 1, but 3 of them did end up meeting their fate on the gallows. President Wilson signed off based on the recommendation of the Army leadership. And they were, the 3 executions at Camp Dodge were among 10 total during the First World War executions for rape. So that it wasn't the only place. Iowa was not the only place. We have the transcripts, if anybody wants to read them. We have the transcripts for all of the court-martials, and I've read them. In the end, they begin to testify against each other. That, you know, he was here, yes, he was there, yes, I saw him on her, that sort of thing, even though it was in the dark. So they concluded what they did based on the testimony provided by the witnesses, the victims, if you will, and the defendants. The execution takes place on 5 July 1918, and it was the only military execution in Iowa, and it was the first and only triple hanging in Iowa.
On to something a little less sobering. Also in August of 1918, they took this, as most everyone has seen, this wonderful photo of the living Statue of Liberty. The photographers were Mole and Thomas, and they went all over the country, so there are a whole series of these that they've taken with soldiers. The amazing thing, and I believe it's on the museum website too, of how they set this up, because as you can see, there's probably 20 people, 20 people kind of here at the bottom, and you get up in here, and you know, they had to make everything according to scale. They took it from a ladder. They arranged everything ahead of
I
time.
built a platform that was 40 feet tall. And they placed a piece of glass in where the photographic paper would go. And they drew on there what the statue is supposed to look like. And when you get out to the tip, I don't know how they pulled it off. That's a long ways. They'd be yelling through a megaphone or saying, oh, a little bit to the left. But they ended up driving in stakes with cloth tape on it. And Mole and Thomas, the two photographers, one of them came from a family that owned a lace manufactory. I don't know anything about making lace, but apparently a byproduct after it's made is there's this cloth tape that is separated. So they had tons of this tape, and so they would drive the stakes in, use that tape, and then when it was time to fall in and out of formation, in whatever shape that facility hosted, Statue of Liberty and Camp Dodge's example, they knew where they were supposed to stand. Believe it or not, they got everybody in position and the photo taken in less than 2 hours.
Was there an estimate about how many individuals it took standing in there?
18,000. 18,000 officers and men. And they're all part of the 163rd Depot Brigade. That was the unit that ran Camp Dodge, and it was the unit that new inductees were assigned to until they decided what infantry company, what trench mortar battery, etc. they were going to go to.
And being in August, and them in their little wool uniforms, and temperatures in the 90s, they did lose 12 soldiers that fainted, which actually is probably pretty, out of 18,000 is probably pretty good. Unless some of them were just standing there because they couldn't follow. Everybody was maybe packed in.
You go to antique shops and you tend to see the panoramic. I've had to walk into an antique shop in Iowa and not see a panoramic picture of troops or of the buildings, the structures taken in Camp Dodge. But I would wager to say that that's probably the most famous and the most republished image that was ever taken in Camp Dodge. I went out to Ellis Island 20 years ago, and they had a lot of materials that depicted the Statue of Liberty, because you can see it from Ellis Island, and they had one of those photos in there on display. It's showing up in children's magazines. Every once in a while somebody will rediscover it. It shows up in a newspaper, it shows up online.
Martha Stewart.
In July of 2007, they had a full-page image, that image, in Martha Stewart magazine. And somebody scanned it in high resolution, and then, as they say, it went viral on the web. And our phone was ringing off the hook. People were saying, is this a real deal? Is somebody photoshopped this? And I know this really occurred. We've got 3 or 4 of the original sepia tone portraits that were made, sold to the soldiers for $2.
One of our mapmeisters, our GIS people, this is approximately where it was on post. And those of you who are familiar with Camp Dodge, the 2 warehouses that face each other are right back in here. So this would be a little bit to the south and then kind of pointing to the west, where the farm used to be years ago.
Kind of apropos here with the coronavirus, but Spanish influenza begins affecting soldiers in late August, September of 1918. It starts at a cavalry post, I forget the name of it now.
Is it Camp Funston? No.
Yes, somewhere around there. Camp Funston, which I think is next to another fort, I can't remember what it is. But it starts there.
Kansas.
In Kansas. And the thing is, there's all kinds of avian flus, there's all kinds of bird flus, but bird flus typically cannot be transferred to people. I'm not a doctor, so my terminology is I get a little weak on this stuff, but it can't be transferred to humans. There has to be some intermediary host. So what they suspect is that it started out as some kind of a bird flu, ended up going to hog, swine, and there it mutates into a form that can be transferred to soldiers. So U.S. soldiers end up, they lose some soldiers. It's not quite as lethal in its first form, but it ends up being taken over to France as we're sending troops, some from the 88th Division and other locations, to France. There it mutates into a more lethal strain. It's passed over to the Germans as well, by back and forth taking prisoners, whatever. So pretty soon all the combatant nations begin to lose soldiers to this influenza. American troops end up coming back to the United States. It's reintroduced mid to late summer 1918 in its more virulent strain and more lethal strain, and that leads to the Spanish influenza epidemic. Why Spanish influenza? The Spanish were neutral in the First World War, and as a neutral country, they didn't want to admit that they were losing people, because the Germans, the French, the British, nobody wanted to say, we've got tens of thousands of troops laid up in hospitals that can't fight because of this flu bug. It might give the enemy a psychological or maybe a numerical advantage on the battlefield, or a perceived one. And so everybody keeps their mouths shut. The Spanish don't, because they're neutral, and they say, anybody else have all these folks dying of this flu, this thing? You know, and at the time they didn't know what was causing it. They didn't know what the virus was. They didn't know how it was being transferred. You see some people wearing masks. They may have been so porous that it didn't matter anyway, but they were sort of on the trail of that. You know, it's caused by handshakes and sharing spoons and drinking out of cups and sneezing on each other and that sort of thing. So it gets the name Spanish influenza because they're the first ones who really started asking questions. We got to let people die here. Does anybody know why? Camp Dodge, like every military base, like every urban area, congested urban area, Camp Dodge loses 702 soldiers as a result of the Spanish influenza. Estimates vary, 30 to 50 million worldwide. Now, people are talking about the virus today. It is nowhere near what happened in 1918, as far as even the number of people that have died. To give you an example, it hits Camp Dodge the hardest between the 6th and the 16th of October in 1918. On average, 50 soldiers a day were dying. We have a letter that was written by a World War I soldier that said he remembered the trucks with the empty pine coffins coming into Camp Dodge in the morning and then leaving at the end of the day to be taken to undertaking establishments in Des Moines, and there were some at Camp Dodge. And not only are people dying at Camp Dodge, but they're dying in downtown Des Moines. They're dying all over. So the undertaking establishments are having trouble keeping up, so to speak, with the involvement. But every soldier that died of the influenza at Camp Dodge was shipped home. Ones that didn't have any next of kin were buried at a U.S. cemetery at Fort Des Moines. It doesn't exist there anymore. In 1946, they exhumed the bodies and they reinterred them at Keokuk. And we have a photograph of a stone that was found at Fort Des Moines that was left over from, he was an influenza victim. And for some reason, when his body was moved, the stone got left behind, or it was face down somewhere, and they were doing a construction project and found the stone. I looked up his name, and he dies like October 10, 1918. He's an influenza victim. And not to pick on the Italians again, but he was an immigrant from Italian, coincidentally, like the other guy we had the postcard from. And he didn't have, on the bottom of the card it says next of kin notified at time of death, and it was blank. I think he immigrated here by himself, joined the army, and within 3 months he was dead.
So that rumor of mass grave up there is a rumor.
Mary's dug into it, no pun intended. Mary's looked into that.
There have been so many questions, everybody's heard about it, and at one time we felt it wasn't true, we hoped it wasn't true, but strange things happen in the war. But by working with archaeologists and record keepers, and of course the Des Moines Register had done a long series on it too, we identified the 702. We were able to put a resting place. It went down every year as things have come online, and it's kind of been my retirement project. About every 6 months I look for the last 30, then it was 25, and now we're down to 18. I don't have a final resting place, but I'm assuming, we just found so many that are out there. And I did have one lady from one of the historical societies, as we found one that had passed away in Iowa. She was looking through the record books, and we were looking for them, and she said, if they know you're looking for them, they will find you. And I have had this happen so many times that it kind of gives me the shivers that they'll just pop up out of nowhere. So.
What was the population of the camp when that 702 died?
It was later in the war. The 19th Infantry Division was there. When the 88th left, the Army started to set up the 19th Infantry Division. Omar Bradley was a soldier. He was a major out there at the time. And about that time, about 25 to 30,000.
They said 10,000 cases. If you can imagine, they had a good-sized hospital, but if you can imagine, you know, being overwhelmed, even as they talked today about that. And there were a number of nurses that passed away from the flu. We had a Red Cross nurse that came from the Cedar Rapids area. She was there 2 days before she too died of the Spanish flu.
So it's 10,000 out of 30,000 that contracted.
Yes.
And 700 not.
And 700.
Two things,
Sir?
How did you, there's a name in the Memorial Union up at Iowa State. How did those names, and he died in that epidemic. His sister lived in Indianola, so they got a call that he was ill and went up and he had already died. But his name is in the Memorial Union on that wall in the memorial section.
I believe
And so-
all of the Iowa State University students who
Oh,
passed away.
maybe that's it.
My great uncle was killed
I
in
suspect
France, and his
Paul-
name is up there. He was an
I
engineering
suspect he
student.
was a student, okay.
And it's amazing, you go up there, and of course, they built the hall for
Yeah.
basically World War I. The letters are this big, and then you go to World War II, and then on and on. And
Okay,
it's just,
that's what
war
that
just
is.
sadly never ends.
Yep.
And we keep having to put their names, instead of on diplomas.
Now, possibly more than 702 died. The influenza ends up causing pneumonia, like acute onset of pneumonia, so people essentially drown in their own fluids and lay in a hospital bed. There are pneumonia deaths going into December and January, but at what point was it or was it not caused by influenza? So possibly more, but the recorded number.
Right. And there were few in that spring, as they were, you know, as we hear on the news now, that there might come another influence. The 1918 pandemic was, there were few in the spring, and then it hit with a vengeance in October, November.
Getting back to the, where were people buried? If someone was a likely candidate to be put in a mass grave, it would have been that Italian immigrant. Nobody claimed the body, but his remains were shipped to Fort Des Moines and they were buried there. The government took charge of his remains. I was out in South Dakota at I can't remember exactly where we were. It was a vacation trip 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And I was walking around a little cemetery and there was a World War I grave marker and it said, died influenza, Camp Dodge, Iowa. October date. So there was somebody else that was shipped to this little township cemetery in the middle of nowhere.
Could it have been just a story that evolved out of maybe they were storing bodies underground until they could
I don't know
send
that
them
they
off to
stored
camp?
them there.
Yeah.
That somebody thought there was a mass burial?
There's some that said there might have been stored temporarily at the Arsenal building. Of course, you don't know for sure. I'm sure there were some storage. They had some Camp Dodge soldiers that went then down to the funeral home here in Des Moines. They had shortages of caskets. And you know, over time, people's memory, just the whole shocking, you know, story of it. And so we're reasonably sure, you know, you can never prove the negative, but we've done our best to find a home for all of those boys. Our boys, I'm starting to think of them as my boys. As World War I came to an end, the hospital was again put into use as soldiers came home or wounded soldiers came home. This one touched my heart. I'm assuming it's a mother with her son still in his uniform and missing his legs, and how his life will be, and his family's life will be changed forever.
Fort Des Moines, just a little footnote, Fort Des Moines had a hospital there as well, Hospital 26, and they treated returning casualties, and they developed I don't know what made it different from others, but they developed a prosthetic limb that ended up with the nickname the Fort Des Moines leg. And so I'm hoping that someday somebody knocks on their door and says, I have, because they don't have one at their knees yet. But I can say, this was issued to my grandfather's hospital, Fort Des Moines, I would say, I know what that is.
Here's some of the faces of World War I. As Mike said, Omar Bradley was a soldier here. And he failed to deploy, and he thought his career was over. And ended up becoming the general of the armies, the U.S.'s last 5-star general. Very storied career. George Whitmer was the first soldier to enlist at Camp Dodge, and later became mayor of Des Moines.
And the namesake of Whitmer Park, they've been doing some work on that. My daughter and I go fish there, but named after him.
Grant Wood was transferred, this is ironic, to a unit that painted camouflage. There's from American Gothic to camouflage. And as Mike mentioned earlier, Jay Hormel. SPAM, short for Spiced Ham. Some of the traces from World War I are the second arsenal that was built there, across the street from that very first one. No fireproof stories on that one. There is, out in the training area, a World War I magazine, and it is, there are 2 left in the United States. The other one is in Camp Shelby, Mississippi, but they moved theirs. So this one is sitting on its original concrete area, and
They trim the growth from around it. There's a chain link fence to protect it. There's a brown and white sign on the outside that indicates that it is a relic of World War I, and it's the only one in the world still in its original location.
because when I started working, it was pretty abandoned, and it had been used for target practice. There were a few holes and such in it. So now we've got it. Hopefully everybody will respect it. As Mike was talking earlier, there are quite a bit of foundations and other things out in the remount station. There are the push piles where they push the foundations. These were probably some type of structure. They didn't kid around when they built stuff back then. They're not just going away. As we move along here, then we had Camp Dodge after World War I. Well, the Federals' presence, they decided to leave. Camp Dodge, the Iowa National Guard was able to reclaim the original land that it owned. And then they also negotiated to get all of the improvements and stuff that the feds had put in there. A lot of the buildings, much to the displeasure of the lumber yards, were auctioned off to people, and so it basically flooded the market with all kinds of lumber. And a number of the houses were taken off, and people used them. They bought them at auction and were very thrifty. I just want to mention, here's, in 1921, the original World War I buildings are still standing here. And then by 1925, they had started to build brick buildings. But people being people, some of my boys are staring out the windows on both of them there. But they once again started to, they had to, of course, replenish, because who wants to join the National Guard after you've just come through a nasty war? So they were trying to recruit, get the soldiers back in. One of their brilliant ideas was building the Camp Dodge pool and bathing pavilion. 2.3 million gallons. It took, what, a week for it to fill up, if I remember correctly. Architects Pierce, Robinson, and Sprague. And it was also a whole design landscape where they wanted to do the whole area kind of in a Spanish kind of thing, but they ran out of money, of course. It was still the major training area. They still had their 2-week training period. We've got, the governor would come out one day, and of course that was a big deal, and they would have inspections. Here we have some cavalry soldiers up here wrestling on horses, and that was really part of their training, and so that they could learn how to keep their seat on a horse. Of course, you see all the young ladies back there probably having the vapors at the shirtless guys out here. But again, big community advantage. People liked coming out and seeing what was going on. Celebrities came out. Most people younger than, like, my sister, had never even heard of cowboy star Tom Mix, but he came out to see the troops. And then, let's see, in 1927, a dirigible came out. Part of the Iowa Infantry, 168, I think, trained to bring this thing in. And people were able to look at it, although an electrical storm came up and they had to leave early. But this gave the soldiers a chance to look at new equipment. And that was the latest, the stealth bomber of the 20s. More agencies came out to Camp Dodge. In the 1930s, the Highway Patrol trained their first troopers in 1935. I'm sure Urbandale and Johnston and other residents were really happy about it because they got to practice by going off post and arresting people for traffic infractions. Then Hawkeye State first met at Camp Dodge in 1938. We had CCC and Works Progress Administration headquartered at Camp Dodge in the 30s. Our lovely stone fence, which most of you have probably seen, was a project there. It was constructed in 1937 and 1938. Famous face?
Reagan came to town, as many of you might know, to be a sports broadcaster for WHO. And he was an athletic guy. He used to be a lifeguard in Alton, Illinois. And I don't remember which river runs by there, but one of his claims to fame, a biographer noted, is that he never lost anyone as a lifeguard. He went in several times to get people, he never lost anybody. And one biography, it doesn't say the Camp Dodge pool, but he saved somebody at a pool in Iowa. We know that he came out to the Camp Dodge pool frequently, and so I'm gonna connect those dots and say it was probably at the Camp Dodge pool that he saved somebody. It wasn't until the late 50s, early 60s that they put a filtration system in. So when they filled the pool, so maybe some of you swam there when it was this way, they'd fill the pool and it just got deep, it got greener and greener as the summer went on. You could dump in there and nobody would see you. I had a guy come into the museum, gosh, this was 15 years ago or more, and they were standing at the front desk, and we had a picture of the pool hanging up by the old main entrance to the building, and she looked at it and she goes, yeah, my husband, he used to go out there and swim, and Dutch Reagan used to come out there and swim, and then she looks at him and she goes, go ahead, tell him. And this guy, he's probably in his 60s, 70s, he said, yeah, my buddies and I, we used to swim at the Camp Dodge pool, and Dutch Reagan had come out there, and there used to be a platform that was chained to the bottom, and you climb up. He said we used to play this game called King of the Platform, and whoever could push the other people off and stay on the platform. He said Reagan, he was an athletic guy that, he'd always end up being the king of the platform. He'd play with us for a while. They said, two of my friends came up on opposite sides to keep him busy, and I swam underneath, and I climbed up, and he didn't see me. And about the time he pushed my buddy in the drink, he said I hit him from the backside and knocked him in the water. And she goes, for about 2 minutes, I was king of the platform until he climbed up there.
We used to have Red Cross swimming lessons there in the 50s and 60s.
The Guard used to do water survival. They put gear on and tread water, so it was lot of uses out there.
A few of the other traces from the 20s and 30s were the headquarters buildings that basically the three arms of the Guard at that time used. Those of you that have been out there have still seen our street of what we call the B series, and those were built as cookhouses at first, and then eventually became villas. But as you can see, the tall chimneys, of course, are gone now. And the pool complex. Here's the cavalry. I love this picture. The cavalry was out for training, and they lined up in front of the pool, which is just beautiful. Sadly, as you all know, we lost our pool. We fought hard to keep it, but we were able to work with the Historical Society, which I'm sure a number of you people have done too, to keep the old flavor of the pool. We kept the walk around so people could see how big the pool was. This kind of mimics the floating platform, and then the pavilion has been very nicely restored inside.
So the pool was destroyed, not filled in?
It's filled in, actually,
It was
yeah.
filled in?
Still there?
Yeah.
So it is still there?
It's still
That's what
there.
I've heard.
I suppose if someone had enough money.
I thought because it was a historical site, they had to leave it intact.
And actually, it was cheaper than knocking it down, because they talked about, just hauling it all out. But by breaking up all that concrete and stuff, it was much cheaper to bring the dirt in.
Yeah, and there were a number of factors that led to the pool's demise. One is that it had some cracks. The filtration system that was put in the 60s was not really up to par anymore. The state's budget went poorly, dried up, whatever you want to put it, in the early 21st century. And then there were a couple other aquatic centers that opened up in the metro that had all kinds of slides and things more than just a pool that you jumped in and swam. And then also there was an organization called Des Moines Parks and Rec.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think.
Started as Playground Association,
Yeah,
and then
and they said, we're not gonna be lifeguards here anymore, so that was sort of strike 5 against maintaining a pool out there.
liability and just even the cost.
What's your knowledge about the size? Because as a little kid, we were told, and I've always believed ever since then, that it was like the second largest pool in the United States.
I've heard
We've
it,
had a hard time proving that, but it definitely is larger than like the Olympic pool for the Los Angeles Olympics. And we think perhaps, second or third filtered pool. So many were filled in before measurements and stuff, but it measured 150 by 350 feet, and then the 2.3 million gallons, and recognized as one of the largest. But I did a lot of research and couldn't quite find out
so
that.
it's essentially the size of a football field. I think it went from 15 inches down to 15 feet at the, used to have 2 high dive boards too on the corners.
I think it was only 10 feet at the deep end. What do you remember anything?
I
I'm not
can't
sure.
remember.
I was thinking it was deeper.
I think it was 10.
I thought it was 10.
There were, as we talked about, the Des Moines River being deadly, unfortunately, there are at least 5 drownings in the Camp Dodge pool over time.
Well, we did a lot of, down at the end there, the shower rooms and all that. Flood of '93, showered up there for a couple of weeks.
It even made the National Geographic magazine. Do you have a
In
question?
Virginia, I thought classmate of yours drowned up
Yep,
there.
Walter Fisher
Oh, really?
drowned out there the summer of our freshman and sophomore year.
Who was it?
Walter Fisher, he's buried up at McDivitt.
Yeah, he went to Urbandale.
Yep, his family lived right off of 70th and Douglas, on 70th.
Yeah, I remember it.
They had a lot of kids. Leonard Fisher, and there was a couple gals, and yeah, there was a lot. Walter was one of the younger ones.
I think my brother was up there with a group of guys. They went up there, but my brother and somebody else had to come back early to deliver papers. And while they were back here, he drowned.
Yep, I was up there too before he drowned, and I was back here because I had to go to work at the cafe.
Yeah.
And so I was back here too when I got word that he had drowned, and I was up there. It was a group of us from Urbandale up there, so, yeah.
Another remnant it was the Red Cross building, the infirmary building. And it is at the top of the hill as you go past. Still there, used for housing now. Some of the warehouses are still there. Again, they built them seriously, even in the 20s and 30s. And then we'll quickly go on to World War II. I don't want to keep you here all afternoon.
Camp Dodge becomes an induction station for all the branches of the military. We have 2 photo albums. They're great documents. They followed, I don't know if he had any choice in it, but a Signal Corps photographer followed this guy around through every step of the induction process. We're sitting around and they're standing there taking the oath, and then he's got not a stitch of clothes on, and he's going through the exam process and having his knees looked at. And I at the very end, he's issued his uniform, and there's a picture of him looking in the mirror, and he's adjusting his tie, and there's a sign above it that says, "You are now looking at the best soldier in the world." Some of the elders, if I would use that term at Camp Dodge, said they remember that sign being at the Iowa Military Academy for a long time in that mirror, and that sign was there.
Yeah.
So when you came and went, but during some remodel it went away. So I wish that could have been saved. But at their peak during World War, yeah, there it is right there. At their peak, they could in process about 1,000 personnel a day. They might have a day or two layover, and then they would depart for basic training by train, as you saw there a second ago. And by the time the war ended, they had inducted about 100,000 Iowans into the military. The first induction center was at Fort Des Moines. And then they decided that they were going to launch an experiment out there called the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and that meant they had to move the induction center for Iowa to Camp Dodge. So it went online mid-42 and operated as such until June, July 1944.
As Mike mentioned, the soldier's journey through, rest assured, telephones were strategically located over certain
Typewriters.
naughty bits.
So they did help him with his modesty.
But I did laugh because another one of these was captioned, "Men on the way to see sex hygiene and training films." Although none of them look all that thrilled, so I'm not sure what they saw. There was also another building on post during World War II for the young men who didn't take to heart their sex and hygiene training. And here, of course, they're leaving on the interurban electric to go on. Another thing in World War II, and I met a lady her father served as the Iowa State Guard, and she said, don't forget them. A lot of these guys, they couldn't serve. There were things, that they couldn't make it, but they wanted to do their part. So they basically took over for the Iowa National Guard and became the Iowa State Guard. And they also trained at Camp Dodge. And they were called up for the longest Iowa call-up, and it was for the riots at the boys' school in Eldora. So they actually, were very serious and very patriotic. They couldn't serve, and I always promised her I'd mention that.
Their commanding officer was a almost lifelong guardsman, Matthew Tinley, who had served as a lieutenant in the Spanish-American War and as lieutenant colonel in the First World War. They kind of pulled him
And they
out of
called him
retirement
back,
and said, hey, we need your help. He's a known and respected guy and commanded the Iowa State Guard.
If you've ever been to a meeting out at Camp Dodge, sometimes they hold it at what they call the Dodge House. It started life as an officer's mess during the World War II period. And then this was the rec center where the soldiers would go and write letters home and all that good stuff and recreate. There was also a hospital built during World War II. Really unusual in that it was the only brick one that we can find that was built in the U.S. during World War II. It was a hospital complex. After the war, it served for Iowa State University engineering students. As they came back under the GI Bill, Iowa State didn't have enough room for them, so they used some of the Camp Dodge buildings. The Iowa Lutheran home in Madrid had a fire, and they allowed some of the residents to stay there temporarily. And then it became the Iowa Military Academy. And shortly before I retired 5 years ago, we were able to develop a plan to bring this back to looking like this again. We were given the funds to make it look like it originally did in World War II. I think we've bored you long enough. And so this is my lead to say, learn more about it at the Iowa Gold Star Military Museum. Mike and crew have wonderful displays out there. If you haven't been or haven't been recently, marvelous place to go. And they'll carry on into the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and on forward.
I brought some brochures. Somebody wants one, let me know. Send you home with that.
And Mike, you might mention, what have been the most recent additions or improvements to the museum?
We added 18,000 square feet on about 10 years ago, and we've been raising money and constructing exhibits in there, so the main gallery is now housed in that addition. And the sawdust is flying at present on a on an exhibit covering the war, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and the War on Terror. So recently we opened in December a World War II in Europe exhibit in November. In December we opened a new exhibit on the Korean War, and so we're working on more modern conflicts.
And so people that might have said, oh, I've been out there.
Yeah, in the last,
that there's more to see.
In the last, 5 years ago, we opened a Civil War exhibit, so we've opened almost one new exhibit per year in the last 5 years. If you get a chance, swing out, please.
And I have a periscope. You can look out over Camp Dodge.
Yeah, we got the only Navy periscope in the state of Iowa. We constructed a control room with the sonar ping, and you can sit down there and look for enemy ships, or you can put your eyeball up and it's 42 feet tall, it goes through the roof of the building, so you can get a bird's eye sweep of Camp Dodge.
Installation day was like cross your fingers and thread a needle because they brought it down through.
80-foot crane and through a 7.5-inch hole through the ceiling, and then a little more, and set it on the pad there, and mount to the floor. So the only thing that holds it is gravity and a nylon ring on one of the roof trusses. There's amazingly for 1,900 pounds, it's pretty effortless to turn that, and there's a bearing out of a Caterpillar tractor that sits in the bottom of there, so that gives it so you can take one hand and turn it around.
If there's any questions or you want to talk to us afterwards, feel free to come up. Thanks for being a great audience.
Thank you so much, appreciate it.